This evening, it's going to be a little bit different. Last week, we mentioned that the Psalms are the basis, the backbone, the breath of monastic life and worship, among other modes of Armenian religious experience. And we also said that once a monk got past the stage where they had to pay careful attention every second to make sure that they were getting the words and the music right together at the same time. Once you got past that, the apparently definitely rote, dull exercise of incessantly reciting the Psalms could actually become something else. Now, mind you, this is not a quick process, and it does take work. Today, I happened to see an interview with the prior of the monastery in Saint Benedict's hometown of Norcia in Italy. Saint Benedict is the one who established the regulations for monastic life in much of Europe. And his townspeople had petitioned the papacy to have monks returned to Norcia for the first time in many, many, many years. And the interview with this monk, this prior, this head of the monastery, gave an interview in which he was saying, I'll put the link in the chat at the end if you want to watch it. It's actually very interesting. He was saying that the Psalms do become second nature after a couple of decades. Monks are not in a hurry, as opposed to parish priests and seminarians. I was just reminded by a seminarian who's present, and seminarians are frequently in a hurry. The monastic rhythm of life is quite predictable. Other people's is not. So what do monks mean when they say that there are other layers that they begin to access in the Psalms, through the Psalms, in the Psalms, beyond simply the words that one sings again and again and again? Maybe at another time we can talk about the role that music plays in this whole endeavor. But this evening, I thought we would look at an exemplary monastic, someone who sang the Psalms on a daily basis throughout his short life, having gone into the monastery thanks to family circumstances at a very young age. And then I would like to look at how he approaches this idea of deeper meanings in the Psalms, how he tries to make it accessible to other people. And in the second half of our time together, we'll look at a couple of examples. So to start with the theory of the other layers of meaning in the Psalms, I'm thinking that most of you, many of you, have had the opportunity to visit here, to visit the palace at Versailles. Do you happen to remember, if you have been there, you look down on the palace, you go in through the front door, Have you ever had the opportunity to go to what's on the left of our picture, into the royal apartments of the Queen? And if you've had a chance to go into the royal apartments of the Queen in that wing of the building overlooking the garden outside to our left, perhaps you will have noticed, it would be hard not to notice it actually, the bedroom of Queen Marie Antoinette. It was a huge room, was and is a huge room. It's very ornate. It's probably very cold. Very opulent. And when the Queen was in it, this room was also full of people. There was no privacy in this bedroom for the Queen. If she was in this room, she had to be on. She had to be playing her part, surrounded by the servants who fought for the honor of being physically near her person. And you have to think that it was probably just a little bit overwhelming to lie in that bed and look up at this ceiling. Fortunately for her, the Queen had a way out. Concealed in the beautifully wallpapered wall of her bedchamber, there was a secret door. They've cracked it open just a little bit in the larger picture so that you can see where it is, but when it is actually fully closed, it's almost impossible to notice. And when this apartment was redecorated recently, they covered up its presence or distracted from its presence by putting fancy furniture next to it. But it was through this door, this almost unnoticeable door, that the Queen's real life took place. If you go through the door, you are in her actual living quarters. Her cozy sitting room, her personal library. She was very well educated and she was a great reader. Her workroom, her room for napping, her space to play with her children. And there were a couple of other private rooms for when the king came to hang out. In all, there's this 2-floor apartment hiding behind that door. And I can only imagine that when she was caught up in the boredom of some state function or other in the Hall of Mirrors on the other side of her apartment wall, she couldn't wait to get back to her space, decorated exactly as she wanted it and reserved for herself and the people she loved alone. Well, not everyone is royalty, but lesser folk also, with castles like this one at Highclere, which you may recognize as the set of Downton Abbey, if you were following that. This also had its own secret rooms. The library is no doubt fine and functional for the purpose for which it's intended. You can imagine there being comfortable chairs and a big table and so on. So you could make good use of this library and its excellent light. But the secret door there makes it possible for a fully other life to be lived behind the books. It's not unrelated to the library, and yet the library does not express all of what goes on in that space. Behind this secret door, again, is an entire region of the castle that's usually off limits for people other than the permanent residents. And in fact, ordinary people like us can also have secret doors. So if you're willing to have an extra wall put into your house, this is also possible for you or me. So as you can see here, when the door is closed, people who are passing by on the stairs that lead down from this attic space to the main part of the house, when the door is closed, they'll see a nice little shelf with some pictures and a few books and maybe some toys on it. It's very nice. But if you open the door, you find yourself in a modest but private, quite lovely personal space. And this creating of secret doors and hidden spaces behind them, I think is a pretty good metaphor for what Gregory of Nottic does for the Psalms. But before we talk about how he achieves this creation or structuring of doors into more private spaces in the Psalms, I think we should spend a little bit of time just looking at the person himself. We're very fortunate to have a manuscript in the Madinataran that contains not one, but 4 portraits of Saint Gregory as we now call him. This manuscript was made in 1173. You can see it's of extremely high quality, not just gold background, but also gold lettering. It was produced at the Great Cilician Scriptorium in Skevra, near Lambron, the largest fortification in northwestern Cilicia and home to the Hetumian family, who would later become the kings of Cilicia. This is a copy of Krikor's Book of Lamentations, or his Book of Prayers. And it was made especially for the aristocrat and Archbishop Nerses of Lambron. Nerses was the person who rediscovered Krikor Naregatsi, wrote a biography of him, brought him back into the public eye. It was Nerses of Lambron who introduced Gregory to his, Nerses's, great uncle, Nerses Snorali, for whom Lambronatsi was named. There's this great story about Nerses Snorali visiting Lambron, which belonged to a branch of his family. And the very young at that point, Sambat, son of the family, was brought in to meet this illustrious great uncle of his. His only impression of the evening was that he was forced to meet some old dude with a beard, a gray beard. Mirza Shnorali, on the other hand, immediately noticed this young man whose name was Sambat at the time, and told the family after he had left, "You're going to give me that one." And so the future of Nerses Jr. was set. Archbishop Nerses thought very long and very deeply about the Saint of Narek and his writing and what it meant and how it could be used and what it could do for people in his own time. And so throughout his copy, this is his personal copy of the Madhyan, of the Book of Prayers, the Book of Lamentations, he had 4 portraits of Krikor placed very carefully. This one, placed at the beginning of the first prayer, is labeled Krikor Pilisopa, Gregory the philosopher, which of course meant philosopher as we know it, but it also meant musician. This is probably referring to both categories of his expertise. He was both a learned individual in the intellectual arts, and he was also, as many people at Narek were, a practitioner of the musical arts. Narek was famous for its musical tradition. And you can see him here in the guise of a scribe, writing out his work. And there are things in the picture that remind us of depictions of evangelists writing the Gospels. The second portrait of the 4 in this extraordinary copy of Gregory's prayers is located at the beginning of Pan 53, prayer 53. It too has a label. In this depiction, Krikor Huskor, Gregory the vigil keeper, is shown in prayer or maybe conversation. Maybe it's the same thing really with Christ. And of course, we know that Armenians always stand to pray. The actual verb for to pray is gal harotus, stand in prayer. So there he is, surrounded by the gold background of the eternal realm, and he's speaking with Jesus, who appears in the usual kind of location for the presence of God. He's at the upper right in a celestial blue space. And around his head is the nimbus that encloses the cross of his humanity within the glory of his divinity. So it's very striking kind of an image. And the distance between them is not so far. And as you see at the bottom of the illumination, one of St. Gregory's feet overlaps the frame of the depiction, putting him, so to speak, with one foot in our space. Then there's the third illumination. Its inscription can't be read anymore, but it shows Gregory prostrate at the feet of the enthroned Christ, between the structure that Christ is occupying, which looks suspiciously like an altar baldachin, and the large tree on the left. So if you like, somewhere between the tree of life in the Garden of Eden and the altar. Then the fourth depiction is a frontal image of Gregory dressed as a priest, holding in his right hand a cross, and in his left arm, he's cradling a book with a jeweled cover. This depiction is labeled Surpen Krikor Juknavor. Saint Gregory the ascetic. Saint Gregory, that's an interesting word. Saint Gregory the monk, it can also mean. And Saint Gregory, the one who makes great efforts. All possible ways of translating that. And as you can see, he too has a nimbus. And this is how we usually think of him. The ascetic saint with his great work. So when we look at the four of these together, we can see a kind of a progression. In fact, we can probably see several interesting progressions. First thing that you notice is that Christ is not present in the first depiction. And so there is a change that takes place over the first three. Christ is present in the second, partially, as a bust, and then in the third, he's there fully. And this seems to correspond pretty well with a progression between what we might think of as Gregory's intellectual effort, the mental effort of composing his prayers. In this depiction, Christ is no doubt present, but only in Gregory's thought. Then in the second illumination, he's present through the spiritual efforts of Gregory the vigil keeper, the one who is conversant with Christ. And then he becomes fully present to Gregory the worshiper / the penitent, who is in the actual presence of Christ. And then finally, he is present as the saint and celebrant who has become Christ, among other ways of interpreting it. We could also look at these four as being parallel to stages in the life of a growing, ever more realized, faithful human being. We begin in the world of our mind for most of us. Our understanding grows and it leads us deeper into a realm of relationship with Christ, which again leads us from dialoguing with Christ or conversing with Christ to abject worship, for lack of a better word, and then to a full identification with Christ in an ideal situation. You could also read this progression as corresponding to stages in the life of David, the psalmist, for that matter. And obviously also the stages of Nerses Lambronatzi's own aspirations. And when we look at these illuminations, we derive a certain understanding of Grigor, how he got to be who he was, at least how Nerses Lampronazi understood this to have taken place. But there's actually more to this. There is a door into these illuminations. They work just fine as they are. But there's also another way to look at them. Let me show you what it is. Just giving you one example. The second illumination, we'll just take this one for the time being. This is the one that shows Grigor in prayer or conversation with Christ in the heavenly distance, but not too distant. And the meaning of this, as we have seen, is clear enough to us. But when you add the text, which is actually the door into the deeper meaning of the illumination, the picture shows us something different. It's not that it doesn't show us Gregory at the stage of his life where he's in close contact with Christ, but not yet at his feet. It does. But there's also another room, so to speak. There's another level, there's another layer. So this prayer continues on from the prayer that goes before it. And it starts out with the word art, so. So in other words, Gregory has been thinking about prayer 42. It's still in his mind. He would like to keep that idea in the head of his reader and of course of himself or his hearer, if these are being said aloud. And what is there is the parable of the talents. Gregory puts himself in the words, he puts himself in the position of the servant in Jesus's story. It's one of a series of parables about the kingdom of heaven and the last times. The person who will need to show his master what he has gained by investing the substantial funds that his master has given him before leaving for another country. I'm sure you're familiar with the story. So let me show you what the exact words are on that page, and then we'll look at it a little more closely. So here we are. These are the words on the page. Art yes Zanuntas merats, vortis mahatsu yergans. Artarev an sahman puruts kankarats, dujits kol hadutzanoch imiumavur. So before I read the English, I should also say that since you already have, I assume, Abraham Terrian's very lovely translation, I'm giving you a different one. One of the wonderful things about Nodek's prayers is that there are many ways to look at them and many ways to translate them, since the words are very flexible. Okay. So I, offspring of sin, child of mortal labor pains, am truly bound to pay interest on a boundless myriad of talents on a single day. It's interesting. Leaving aside some of the odd things about the way that this is written, this gives us a new context for that depiction of Gregory speaking to Christ. This conversation with Christ is not so much ecstatic as it is a case of Grigor trying to explain to his master, his strict master of whom he is somewhat afraid, why he didn't invest. Why, instead of using the money, the talents that had been given to him, entrusted to him, he did not go out and make 10 more, 5 more, 2 more, whatever. Instead, he hid it in the ground on which he's standing. So the words open for us a little door into a more private part of Grigor's experience. In other parts of his prayers, he's very confident in the talents that he has received. He asks boldly and clearly for his work to live forever. He describes the joy he will feel at laying it before the feet of Christ. But here in this illumination, there's an awareness that whatever he has done has not lived up to the magnitude of what he has been given. There would be room for better investment. So, one example of the way that a text can become a door for an illumination. You could also read it the other way and say that the illumination becomes a bit of a door for the text, because the text sounds a little bit dire as it stands. I am bound to pay interest on a boundless myriad of talents on a single day, and we could look at that more closely. But what it shows us is that there is an intimate conversation around that happens. It's not simply the Lord dismissing an unfaithful servant. It's interesting to see that Gregory also had a literal hidden space where he could go deeper, both literally and figuratively. As you can see on the map, Narekevank, the monastery of Narek, which is circled in red there, is in the middle of a landscape that's thickly dotted with monasteries. The Lake Van area is a major center and wellspring of Armenian spirituality. But when Gregory wanted to get away, he chose a place that was not far from Narek, from his monastery. This is a color retouched photo, obviously, from the 19th century. He would get away to a rocky height around 2 kilometers, a little less than a mile, northwest of the monastery, just a little bit nearer to the shore of Lake Van. And in that rocky height, that rocky outcropping, if you knew where to look for it, there was a door. Doesn't look like much. Not everyone will see it. But hidden behind this door was a complex of caves. Caves which the monks modified, taking advantage of and adding to and building on, making more complex the natural formation of the rock in order to create spaces for living and for working. You can see there are book niches in some of the walls, as well as a small church, a church with natural light, and a view of the lake in the distance. Can't really see it here, but you can as you get closer. And even a balcony to enjoy the view from at different times of year. So here it is, same opening, different time of year. And it's interesting, this is his chosen place of refuge. He would spend months here, away from the comparative noise of his monastery and all the things that were going on there. It's interesting that to reach this hidden door, which you can see there to the right of the picture, some climbing is required. Grigor and his monks must have been in quite good physical condition. And just as some climbing is required to reach his literal hidden place, some climbing is metaphorically also required to enter into his use of the Psalms. Psalms which, mind you, before he started to compose his book of prayers, he had sung every day for around half a century. So that would be 18,250 days before he started to compose his book. That's a lot of Psalms experience. So I'd like to take, it's a little early, but I have more in the second hour that I want to make sure we get to. And I'll see you back at 5 of. All right, we are back. So if it's possible for someone like Gregory, who has done the Psalms 18,000 plus times over the course of his monastic career, to find new things in them, to find in those very familiar words, places where if you kind of tap on the wall of the obvious words, you can hear a little hollow space behind it. You know that there is something there. How does he do this? How does he incorporate the Psalms into his own writing? And then how does he structure doors through his own writing to connect to the Psalms and offer people something more than what actually appears? Now, we are certainly not going to be able in this amount of time that we have this evening to look at more than probably 2 examples of the way that Gregory makes it possible for people who know the Psalms well to bring them into their understanding of his prayers, which we know that he did share with his monastic brothers. So I think he wanted there to be for them, as they listened to his prayers, he wanted there to be for them little moments of recognition. Oh, I know what that's from. I know when we sing that. I know what that psalm verse is. And then to also include something in the prayer that would take them, as they go back into that psalm in their mind, that would take them into a new place with it. But at the same time, he didn't want it to be an exercise of, well, if you're really smart, you'll get this. He wanted it to be not obtrusive. He wanted it to be not in your face. He wanted it not to be like a riddle, so you're going to have to think about it some more, because after all, with all of the constant repetition of the Psalms, one had stopped thinking about the words. So he didn't want to bring that kind of effortful quality back into the way people were approaching his prayers and the Psalms. Instead, he wanted it to be a kind of an opening of a window, a little light that comes in where you're not expecting it. He would set up these doors that are of all different sizes. Some of them are massive, and then some of them are very small. He would set these up so that they could be accessed at will and at capability by his audience. His audience, even though he expected his work to live on for generations and generations after him, he was not necessarily expecting it to be a worldwide phenomenon. He was expecting generations of monks after him, generations of monks who would go through that same preparation, that same constant steeping in the Psalms. He was writing for them. And as you know, before there were chemical dyes, the way to dye a cloth was to dip it into the color, remove it, let it dry, dip it again. So the constant re-dipping of the cloth into the dye, into the vegetable dye, was what created the color. And the more you do that, the deeper the color gets. The more you do that, the more fast the color becomes to the cloth. So there's this process that he's assuming his reader has gone through or will be going through at whatever stage of it they are. They're expecting that steeping, that gradual reinforcement of the dye of the Psalms to be a part of their experience. Because this is not normally a part of our experience in the 21st century, unless we happen to be fortunate enough to be in a monastery that still maintains this discipline. The experience is a little harder for us. It's a little bit more difficult for us to be triggered by verses from the Psalms, by phrases or even words, images from the Psalms, the way his audience was. But sometimes it happens. I know it happens for the seminarians. I know it happens for clergy. And so in a way, this is spoken to them, but hopefully we're not going to leave behind any of the rest of us. So how often does Gregory do this in his writing? Well, thanks to Professor Abraham Terrion's diligence, I can say without having counted it myself, that in the Madhyan, in the Book of Prayers, in the Book of Lamentations, Gregory mentions David 34 times by name. And alludes to him 13 more times, not by his name, but as the psalmist. Gregory quotes the Psalms number and verse very specifically 21 times in his prayers, but there are almost countless allusions to the Psalms or use of words from the Psalms that he doesn't point out specifically. Again, because his fellow monks would no doubt have recognized these things from their own frequent repetition of the Psalter. So, because Gregory had found over his half a century of doing this, had found many secret rooms for himself inside the Psalms. In his poetry, he installed his own hidden doors that could lead the adventurous, psalm-steeped soul to higher or deeper, however farther, whatever we want to say about it, insights into the Psalms themselves and into the liturgies in which the Psalms were embedded. So not only had he discovered that the Psalms meant more than they appeared to on the surface, but he had also found that those meanings were integral to a person's understanding of the service in which the psalm was said. He was very deliberate about this. He often put himself in the shoes of the psalmist. Or he took the psalmist as his model, very specifically and intentionally. So here we have a little section from his 32nd prayer, the second piece of it. Let me read it for you, and then we'll have a look at it from a more psalmsy point of view. Prayer says, At, yes, badmemas danor tartial, voches meres Jerusalemi, est markarein Ramanarutian, vor arge govurten nachni. Jev gam danan hagopa, zanorenutunus nora. Al imuis jamanetzit heidnutian. Kanzi avar and aredesma hu harelov, est markarein hanti manetzits zis, inken, insen, imovest zainiv. Est salmosori. Vorbesi Hans Naragan Haisam Hamaina Badum Hostovanutene, Voch Garodacial Gernagin, Miankamain Ispar Serpetzites Ordnial Hramanav Eit. I will not recount the sins of Jerusalem here, as the prophet was commanded to do concerning the people of old. Or as another spoke about the iniquity of the house of Jacob. Rather, I will proceed to reveal my own. I wail as when the peril of death strikes, in accordance with the prophet, and with my own voice I reproach myself in accordance with the psalmist, so that none of this prescribed comprehensive confession will need repeating, but I will be cleansed at once, completely, by your blessed command, O one who is. So, this is understandable as it is. It's very penitential in its tone. As a monk, Gregory says, I'm not called upon by God to accuse other people of their sins, no matter how blatantly obvious. I am not a prophet. A prophet like Micah, who at the beginning and the end of his prophecy recounted God's lawsuit against Israel and Judah over the way that they were worshiping idols alongside him, together with their worship of him, and they thought that that was all right. He's not like Jeremiah, who described how God's people had become, as Jeremiah says, imas dunk ichar kordzel, yeves pari inch arnel voch kidatsin. They're wise in doing evil, but to do good, they have no idea. So instead of those two prophets, speaking of other people, prophets that he quotes in this section, Gregory says that since his own death is imminent in his consciousness, if not necessarily in his physical life, although it actually was probably pretty close by the time that he wrote this, Gregory says he will recount his own sins. I will accuse myself, he says, with my own voice. Because by doing this now, he will avoid having to go through the painful process again. In one day, the day of judgment in this case. Okay, so he's putting himself in the position of David, who did this as well. And he's not only putting himself kind of imaginatively in the persona of David, he's not just artistically imitating David's readiness to confess and repent, to confess and change. He is actually quoting David. It's not just that he is in accordance with the psalmist, it's also that he is using the words of the psalmist. So as it says in Psalm 31:5, in Armenian, because it may be different from the English and the Hebrew, is meresim tzutzitskez. This is David speaking. Yevazanor enutunesim voch tzadzgetzitsiken. Then the tone changes a little bit. Asatsi tebad metzitz insen es meresim. Yevtu tochtses zamanain amparashtuchunesim. I will display my sin to you, and I will not conceal from you my misdeeds. I have said, I will relate to you my sin, and you will forgive all of my impieties, all of the things not worthy of my faith, all of my ungood things. Many ways we could look at that. So in this 31st Psalm, David too is preparing to confess things, to get them out of the way, because he knows that God will forgive him. Tochtses zamenein amparashtuchunesim. You will forgive all of my ungood things. You will release them. Tohul has a lot of different meanings that are all kind of related and are part of the nexus of Armenian ideas that we would probably call soteriology if we were being dry and more Western about it. We're going to God will let these things go. God will let these things drop. God will release these things. All of that. And as we read in Prayer 32, that is Gregory's progression of thought. I'm going to confess these things now so that I will not have to repeat this on the day of judgment. Okay, so that by itself is an interesting realization. Psalm 31:5 is actually the text that Gregory is using and building his own infrastructure of ideas around it, embedding it in his own process of thought. Now that we see this little door, we can take a step across the threshold of it, not just notice the door as we did when we noticed that this Psalm 31:5 is being quoted here. We can take another step across the threshold of this door when we realize that in the mind of the person listening to Gregory, almost automatically, their mind will bring up for them the rest of the psalm. And so the rest of the psalm can also be implicitly included in what Gregory is saying. It's included as background to Gregory's decision to rebuke himself. So let's look at how that psalm begins. First of all, it's a psalm of wisdom. Kind of counterbalance to the idea of people who were wise to do evil and had no idea about doing good. So the psalm starts out, Yerani, tohutun yerev meratz, yev tzadz getzan amanayin hansank nora. Yerani aren vorum voch hamares sideres meres nora, yev voch ko ninkutuni peran nora. Loretzias yev mashet sanamanayin voskerkim ar agel ins arder zoranabaz. Ideve yevikisheri Zanratav tseren koiveraim, tartsiali tishvartun, ziharan his pushk. Listen for familiar things in the English. Blessed is the one whose sin has been released, forgiven, dropped, and all his transgressions have been covered over. Blessed is the man whose sin God does not take into account, and in his mouth there is no deceit. I was silent, and all my bones were worn away until I cried to the Lord daily. Your hand was heavy on me by night and day, turning me to misery because thorns pierced me. If you're familiar with this psalm in its normal English, this may be a little bit different to what you're used to. This is the version that Gregory would have been working with. So we notice first of all, Yerani, blessed is, repeated twice. So it's all as though this part of the psalm has two different, maybe even three different sections to it. Has blessings at the beginning, beatitudes, if you like, at the beginning. Then it has a statement about himself, the situation in which he found himself. And then there is a piece directed to God. Your hand was heavy on me by day and night. Bringing this extra beginning of the psalm into our awareness, I think is quite important. Because while the prayer, while the pan may give us the impression that repentance, confession was easy for Gregory, because after all, he was a saint, right? But when we know the context of the verse, we can see that that was not the case. In that implied context of the verse that he actually quotes, he says, I was silent and all my bones were worn away. I did hide things. I did cover them up. One assumes that this, my bones are worn away, comes from trying to hold oneself together and keep walking, perhaps as if everything was okay. We can also see that Gregory is implying that God did not let him get away with this. Your hand was heavy upon me, night and day, turning me to misery because thorns pierced me. So Gregory doesn't need to say, I found this really difficult, because the person who is familiar with the psalm will know that, because they know the first part of the psalm. So through that little door, we have entered into some context, silent context. And if we look closely at the last line here, we might just see another little door. It's little because it's not obligatory that you go through it. You're free to follow this odd phrase or not. Turning me to misery because thorns pierced me. The psalmist or Gregory or anyone praying the Psalms who doesn't come clean to God suffers from thorns because thorns pierced me. I was miserable. When you hear the word thorns, pushk in Armenian, what story comes to your mind? I have a seminarian here who's making a crown of thorns around his head. Yes, absolutely. And why would there be a crown specifically of thorns in that story? The story of Christ's trial and crucifixion. As he says, it probably shows up in the Old Testament somewhere. Indeed, it does. Yeah, it doesn't come up very often, so it's relatively easy to follow this one. Who knows how many things I miss because I am not that familiar. But this one is this is easy. The word doesn't occur that often. We can get this. We've got this. As soon as you see thorns, you think of the crown of thorns of Christ, and then you think, okay, what might that have been symbolizing or drawing our attention to? And you will think of the hard labor that living in the world became once Adam left paradise. If you read Genesis 3:18 in God's dialogue with Adam, Eve, and Satan, or Adam, Eve, and the serpent, you see this, talking to Adam. Anidzialitsi yergiri kordzisko, durdmutyamp geritsas azna, I think in his hatsko, zamanayna vuruskenatskots, pushk yevdadask husustekez, yevgeritsas azpanjar vairi. Earth will be cursed in your labors. You shall eat bread with sadness. Actually, the word is depression. All the days of your life. It, the earth, will sprout thorns and thistles for you, and you shall eat wild vegetation or vegetation of the uncultivated fields. Interesting. So what are the thorns that pierce a human being when God's hand is heavy on them and they have not yet lightened themselves or been lightened or had released from themselves the harm that they have incurred and caused in life? It's a primal thing. So if we want to go a step farther, if we want to go back into the psalm and we want to take up those yeranis, those blessed is, those beatitudes that are in the psalm verse, our mind will automatically go to the Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount. And so the question arises, what makes the Beatitudes about inheriting the earth and being comforted and being filled and obtaining charity. Some other time we'll talk about Wohlmutun. What makes those beatitudes work? Why does Jesus use a word like Yerani? Yerani, Yeraneli, Yeranyal. No longer being under the burden of the harm that one has done or the harm that has been inflicted on one, which is the meaning of merk. And of course, it's plural, because none of us has been harmed just once or done harm to self or others just once in life. So we might understand by implication that Gregory wants all of those things that are in the Beatitudes, and that he is willing to take the tough step to get them, the tough step of confession and change. We'll come back to this momentarily. Sometimes the presence of words from a psalm, I'm going to tie this together with what comes next. Sometimes the presence of words from a psalm, a quotation from a psalm, sometimes that presence is not just a door, it's not just a hint that here's a door to deeper levels of a specific prayer that Gregory is writing, but they also make it possible for one of his monks, one of his very liturgically practiced monks, to place a given prayer within a service. And so instead of just letting a person into a deeper level of the psalm, Gregory also lets the monk who does liturgy regularly into a different aspect, a different way of understanding that particular liturgy. So if we take upon prayer 33, the first section, we can see an example of how this is done. And because this is quite a long section, I've put up only the English on the slide, but you can, of course, check it out in the Armenian for yourself if you like. The site Garabaharan has it in full, the full searchable classical Armenian text of the Madyan, of the Book of Prayers. And so here, we're going to see some interesting things. Now, blessed and compassionate one, may this arrangement of words of worship offered to you from the produce of my soul, the fruit of my soul, be added to that of the bearers of incense. May you mix it, my words, in other words, with the sweet blend of oil of the pious woman Mary, whom you accepted with the most wondrous respect, equal to that elicited by the blessed prostitutes. May my humble words also extol you, the exalted one. Allow them, like that oil, to reach to your unreachable and lauded head, absolving me of the reproach in the Psalter. Let not the oil of the sinner anoint the leafy boughs of my head. Okay. Anybody who gets to the end of that goes, yeah, I know that. I know that verse. This is Psalm 140, verse 5. It's part of the Vespers service. Great, now we have a kind of an anchor here for his liturgically observant, psalm-steeped monks. And it's very interesting combination or melange of things that he does here. He describes his words as fragrant oil. So he's including himself. Here's the verse that he's specifically quoting out of Psalm 140. The righteous person will rebuke me. With compassion, he will set it before me. A sinner's oil will not anoint my head. So he's including himself by quoting this and bringing the oil into it. He's putting himself with the myrrh-bearing women, or in Armenian, the oil-bearing women, Yula Perganaik. In the gospel story, however, the women come to the tomb bearing not oil, but chunk, incense. According to Mark 16:1 or Luke 24:1, badrastetzin hungus, they prepared incense. And so in this illumination, which just for fun happens to be from around Lake Van, you can see them carrying, at least one of them you can see carrying a censer. So maybe Gregory was not the only person in that region to make connections between oil and incense being brought to honor the body of Christ. So he connects himself, first of all, to those women, but then he also very explicitly connects himself to a very complicated story or set of stories. Stories of women who anointed Jesus. And there are a lot of dissonances in the way that this story or stories get told. In Mark 14 and Luke 7, the woman who anoints Jesus is described as a sinful woman. And in Mark 14, the sinful woman anoints Jesus's head. In Luke 7, the sinful woman anoints Jesus's feet. So there are these differences. It's hard to know how many of these women there actually were. Two of these stories are told towards the beginning or towards the middle, maybe, of Jesus's career. Two are told at the end. So it's confusing, and I think the confusion actually draws attention to the significance of what takes place. Anyway, the woman who anoints Jesus's head in Matthew 26, right at the end of the gospel, is not described as sinful. Nothing is said about her sinful state. The only story that specifies a name for her is the version of this story that's told in John 12. There, she's specifically named as Mary, sister of Martha and Lazarus. And she's described as anointing Jesus's feet. So we have anointings of feet, anointings of head. Which one is Gregory pulling on? Which set of these stories is he pulling on? He's pulling on the ones that anoint the head. It says, may my words rise like oil to the head, the unreachable head. In other words, he identifies with the non-sinful woman in Matthew 26 and the sinful woman in Mark 14. He takes both stories to apply to himself and his attempt to make his words into fragrant oil. And then he also includes Mary from John 12. May you mix the oil of my words with the sweet blend of oil of the pious woman Mary, whom you accepted like the blessed prostitutes. So he leaves open the possibility that there are 4 different stories and they all happened. And he may even be including in that blessed prostitutes group others like Jesus's own ancestor, the righteous prostitute Rahab in the book of Joshua. So that's quite a mouthful. He's identifying himself as a person who wants to devote fragrant oil, the fragrant oil of his words, to the head, his head, Christ. So we've got 2 sets of imagery within a couple of lines. First of all, he compares himself to the oil-bearing women, and he compares himself then to the others who anointed Jesus. So what the heck is that Psalm 140 verse doing there? Because it flips things around. And it says, the oil of a sinner will not anoint my head. That kind of gives you whiplash, just a little bit. He's been talking about women, the beauty of the oil and so on. And then suddenly we're looking at the oil of a sinner. There's no women there at all. But there is a little tiny door. Every one of Grigor's monastic brothers, and many others as well, would recognize the psalm from the Vespers service. So it may be, this is speculation, but it could be, that this particular prayer was written as the result of a moment when Gregory's mind, freed from the constraints of having to remember the words and the melody all the time, realized that at Vespers, what we are doing, among other things, is turning words into oil, turning words into fragrance, which is also, oil is also a metaphor for mercy, for charity, for making things easier for someone else. So in the Vesper service, which begins the process of the liturgical day, which will commence as the light departs, and it will found itself in the darkness of night, we are creating oil that we can use in our commemorating of Christ's saving burial in the dark and for his resurrection still in the dark. Also, for Gregory's monks, there was another door too, right at the end of the verse. So here we are again. Charadestzezis artaren, vogormutiamp agenhantiman arastzezis. Yuch meravori mi odztzees kluchim. The righteous person will rebuke me. With compassion, he will set it before me. And you could punctuate this in different ways too and read it differently. A sinner's oil will not anoint my head. But when we looked at that, you go, wait a minute. Wait. That's not what Pon 33 says. Or Pon 33 does not say that. It doesn't say, it does not say a sinner's oil will not anoint my head. What does it say instead? Here's the psalm. The oil of a sinner will not anoint my head. It's very nice and clear. And suddenly you have to wonder, mi odze as derev vostots kakatan yuch meravorim. What? The oil of a sinner will not anoint the leafy branches of my skull. What? Is it Christ speaking of what will and will not anoint his head? Is it Gregory speaking? Is it David speaking? Or is it a tree? The change from kluchim to derev vostots kakatan is a big difference. What in the world is going on? How did we get from a human being, no matter who it might be, or a human divine being, if we think that this is being spoken in the persona of Christ, which is one way to look at it. How did we get to leafy branches? Does your skull have leafy branches? Not really. Probably. Mine doesn't. Even if I do wake up in the morning sometimes looking a little weedy, it doesn't have branches. So it seems that for Gregory, when he recited Psalm 140, verse 5 for perhaps the 10,000th time, a little door opened in it for him. A little door into a deeper understanding of what's going on in us in this verse. And so he lays here in a pretty obvious way the key to that door for any of his brother monks who would like to walk through it. Again, you don't have to. You can just read this and go, well, that's an interesting change, the leafy branches of my skull. And you might think about yourself then as a fruitful tree or some such thing. That's fine. But when you see leafy branches, and you think back into the Psalm, Yerani, blessed is the man whose sins have been forgiven, etc. Suddenly two things may come together like the contacts on those wires you use to start your car. And suddenly something happens. Because a monk will remember that Psalm 1 combines these things. It combines blessedness, beatitude, and a tree. And so at the beginning of Psalm 1, we read, Yeraniale aer vorvoch kanats, ichorutas ampareshtats, ijanabari megavorats navoch yagats, yevhatoris jandits voch nestav, yevyeritsina vorbest zarmi dengyal ikanatses churts, voris bedur yuri jamudatse yevderev nora mitapesci. Blessed is a man who has not walked around in the council chambers of the wicked, who has not lingered in the path of sinners, in other words, to converse with them on the way, and has not sat in the seats of the pestilent, of people who are like a plague. He will be like a tree that is planted in the waterways, in the areas where water lingers under the ground, who will give his fruit in season, and his leaves will not fall. So, to be a leafy tree, a righteous person, if we too want to be anointed by the same righteous one who anointed David, it behooves us to bring forth leaves and fruit on our branches. And the first part of the psalm tells us how to achieve verdant righteousness, like a monk at prayer. to always be watered by that, to be planted in that, not to be wandering about in the councils, the council chambers, the thought processes of people who do not worship God, or to spend our time in their paths, disputing with them, discussing with them, whatever we're doing with them, but instead to cultivate leaves that will not fall by being near that water. Okay, so we have blessedness and leaves. That's nice. I think that's a rather good thing to be thinking about. Because at the beginning of the psalm, it tells us, I'll horenes diaren yengam knorayev horenes nora chores tsina ideve yeviki sheri. And we just saw those words too, but we don't, ideve yeviki sheri, we don't have time to stop over that right now, and how it connects to Gregory's prayer. The English of that is, instead, his will is in the Lord's law, and he thinks deeply on his law. There's an extra and there, I see, by day and by night. So how do we get to be the leafy branching tree? This is how it's done. Monastic discipline, whether you're in a monastery or not. But that's not the only door that's in this last little thing, this weird image of the leafy branches of my skull. The second door is in Leviticus, and it's again in the book of Nehemiah, in the story of the Jews returned to Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity. In both those places, it is specified that at the feast of Sukkot, the feast of booths, with all the implications of that feast and its connections both to wandering in the wilderness and to the transfiguration story, which we might talk about another time, it specifies that leafy branches are to be collected in order to build the booths in which people would rejoice outdoors for the duration of this feast of their liberation, their special time in the wilderness. And so the monk doing Vespers, reciting Psalm 140.5 and thinking about the leafy branches, can think of himself potentially as building a booth. What you're doing at Vespers is building a booth, like Peter, who, wanting to rejoice in the presence of Elijah and Moses together with Jesus, suggested that that would be a good thing to do. And so in depictions of the Transfiguration, you will often see leafy trees. So a monk reciting Psalm 140, verse 5, in Vespers might well be thinking of, how do I build a structure that will continually support me as I rejoice in the things that God has done for me in the presence of the divine, and so on. There's a third little door in this last verse, the leafy branches of my skull. You may or may not want to actually try this door. I don't know. If you don't, you can just kind of tune out for the next 5 minutes, and I'll catch you later. We're going to look at that weird word for head in Gregory's prayer. In the stories of anointing, the word for head is the ordinary Armenian word kluch. But in prayer 33, Gregory substitutes for the ordinary word kluch, which would have a lot of things you could do with that. He substitutes the much rarer word kakatan. which can mean the top of a mountain, but it more normally means a skull. And it could be, it's always possible that Gregory used that word instead because he wanted a word there with more syllables for whatever musical reason. But then again, maybe he did choose it specifically because it meant skull. The word for Golgotha in Armenian is the place Kakatan, the place of the skull. Luke 23:33 and John 19:17 both mention that, go out of their way to mention it. And so one way to look at that is as it is in this depiction. In crucifixion scenes in Armenian and in other traditions, a skull is frequently shown directly beneath the cross of Christ. And if you go to the Holy Sepulchre Church, you'll see that this is memorialized there as well. In other words, the skull of Adam. The second Adam, Christ, obtaining release for the first man, Adam, symbolized by the skull. So that's one thing that you can do with it. But then you stop and you think, okay, what actually stood on the Kakat? What stood on Golgotha? The cross. And how do Armenians depict their cross? Here, I probably could have picked a clearer one, but I like this one. That's why it's in here. Leafy branches. Almost always, Armenian crosses are shown with some variety of vegetation on the arms. Here, the vegetation is pretty elaborate. So Armenian crosses are shown with leafy branches on the kakatan. Leafy branches on something which stood on the place of the skull. They're also shown, Armenian crosses set up on the place of the skull, are also shown bearing fruit, like the righteous man in his season, yes, from Psalm 1. So what stands on the skull, the leafy branches on the skull, combine with the seasonable fruit of the righteous man of Psalm 1. And sometimes also, Armenian crosses are shown planted by the water. Here you have a lovely, this is one of my favorite khachkars, a lovely cross with the branches, the leafy branches and the fruit, surrounded by the intertwining four rivers of paradise. So whether you choose to take the description of paradise as a kind of a foreshadowing of the cross as a tree planted by waters, as the ultimate righteousness, or whether you choose to look at it the other way, there we have together, thanks to the word kakatan rather than the word kluch, a complete melding of the verses. Okay, anyone who went away 5 minutes ago can now come back, because Gregory does not force anyone to go through the doors that he has structured in his work by using the psalm texts judiciously, changing them in significant ways. You don't have to go there. So whether a fellow monk with many years of psalmody under his belt wanted to test out all the doors just to see what was behind them, or whether a monk was prepared to peer behind just a few, open them up and see what was there. It's all well and good. The doors are sturdy constructions. Unlike the ones in this picture, they're not obtrusive. They're not in your face. You don't have to always look at them. And it's also perfectly possible, acceptable, and lovely for a monk never to want to go through any doors at all. Might be enough just to know that in the homey and familiar facade of the recitation of the Psalms, there is more than meets the eye. That might be enough to know. For many of us, Gregory realized, it would be enough just to stand in the bright spaces that he created in his prayers. That would be more than enough light for us. And we might never feel a need to go through the door at the end of the hall. We don't need to do that in order to realize that we are in the presence of great richness, spiritual opulence, and liturgical royalty. So what I wanted to do for you this evening, with you this evening, is just by taking these two little examples of where you can potentially go, where Gregory has made it possible for you to potentially go by using the Psalms, by looking at them in a slightly different way, as his prayers make it clear. It's possible to go far. And even if you don't, the prayers have still touched you in a way that other things may not. So just one example of how Armenian fathers used the Psalms directly. Next week, we're going to begin looking at how they interpreted the Psalms verbally as an exercise of interpretation, rather than embedding them in their own artistic mysticism.